Hi, good afternoon, and welcome to Recruiter Zone. Tell Me I'm Wrong is the show. I'm recording this section because, like the idiot that I am, a portion of the beginning of the show that was broadcast earlier was skipped out on Crowdcast. So we missed a couple of minutes at the beginning, which was essentially the introduction to the show from Hung Lee. So imagine Hung is here, introducing our two guests. Our two guests today are Gareth Biggerstaff from BIT, resourcing in Edinburgh, and Michael Taggart from FPSG, also in Edinburgh. Both of them IT recruiters, both of them extremely well experienced in the recruitment game industry, and both extremely well qualified to speak about the topic for today, which is counteroffers. So as I say, we skipped the part before where Hung would be introducing everyone, and I essentially made the argument at the beginning where I was making the case for counteroffers and how they can be a fantastic way of resetting your career, a fantastic way of resetting your position within an organization, and that contrary to popular belief, especially amongst recruitment consultants, counteroffers can be very much a good thing rather than the thing to be avoided as much as possible in accepting. The accepted norms are predicated on a document that was circulated widely from about 1982. I think it originally appeared in the Wall Street Journal, although that's yet to be proven. But I remember photocopying and seeing photocopies of this document going around and giving it out to candidates who I wanted to persuade not to accept a counteroffer, because I would have preferred them to take the offer that's been made to them by my client. And of course, that would result in me getting a fee. Of course, a lot of the statistics based in that document were predicated on making sure that candidates did not accept a counteroffer, and it was done so in a time when the working environment was much more, the environment was much more the case where people would be working for a given employer for, if not their entire career, then certainly a sizable chunk of their career. And in accepting a job offer elsewhere, or in going in to make a resignation, to telling your boss that you had a job offer elsewhere, the employer often would take that really personally, would take it as a bit of an insult, a slap in the face, that that they would take it that for whatever reason you were rejecting them, when of course it wasn't rejecting them, it was about accepting something elsewhere. But the environment that we work in nowadays is one where people are much more used to changing jobs, changing careers much more frequently, rather than being in a workplace for 10, 5, or even 2 years. People are switching employers almost every 18 months, year, 6 months even, and it's far less the case that you would look at someone's CV who changed jobs as frequently as that and describe them as a job hopper, because it's much more normal nowadays. It's much more normal for employers to accept that people will circulate and move on within a certain period without getting too worked up about it. So when people resign from a job these days, it's in a much different environment to it was back then, and employers are much more sanguine about it. Even though the cost of losing someone is still going to be felt keenly by an employer, they are more, you might say, adult about it these days, and more accepting that this can happen. That said, a good employer will, in the face of a good candidate or a good employee resigning and wanting to go elsewhere, make a good honest effort to try and retain that candidate, to hold them, to stay working for them, and not look at it in a petulant manner that they might have done before, or certainly as was described in that document, and the kind of childish behaviour that can occur when people resign, especially when they resign in a huff, and an employer escorts them from the premises. That doesn't really happen these days, and it certainly doesn't have to happen with progressive employers who are forward thinking, and of course with candidates who are forward thinking in the way that they look at how they work. So candidates are not seen as a flight risk if they accept a job offer and stay with an employer. They're not seen as less trustworthy. They're not seen as disloyal in the same way as it might have been described before. If a candidate accepts a counteroffer in the right circumstances and confirms all the details of that counteroffer, then that can be a great instance where they can reset their relationship with an employer who perhaps was a little negligent in looking after the individual, and it may well be a good position where the candidate can reset the course, plot a new course within that same employer, and work towards bigger things in the future with that employer. So a candidate indeed can accept a counteroffer so long as they do it in a professional, adult way, and don't have the upset that is often caused by an employer taking a resignation as an insult and responding badly to that. So the program that you're going to hear now will begin with Gareth and Michael responding to those points, which I made initially, but like an idiot, neglected to have recorded properly. So now we'll carry on with the rest of the show. Thank you.
Just trying to protect their fees.
Well, it's interesting to think that we're talking about money from both sides, typically. So I would absolutely refute the fact that recruiters are all about the money. I think over a period of time, we typically get to know our candidates. And one point in particular that I would look to highlight is it's the outset of that process where you need to know what the candidate is actually moving for. Ultimately, it's not always going to be about money. And I think the candidate journey that someone is going to go on with a recruiter, yes, there's got to be a price at the end of it, and that's why we do it. Our front loaded costs. There's no money straight away for the recruiter. That it's ultimately on delivery of the right person. But if someone gets to the end of a process and loses a candidate to a placement for a counteroffer, I would be concerned about the process that we'd started out on. To be quite frank, I think that understanding the real motivations and preempting that a counteroffer is going to come at the end of the process is ultimately what any good recruitment consultant would be doing. It's a very topic that we discussed here at FPSG today in a weekly training session that we do. We covered that counteroffer topic, and yeah, it's something that we set out on a journey with the candidates to make sure that if we're going to protect our commission, ultimately, which is a large part of why we're in the industry, ultimately we've got to make sure that we tick the boxes right from the very beginning.
Do you so as I understand your argument, Michael, you're saying that the emergence of a counteroffer and the threat that the candidate might leave is actually evidence of a flawed process or a failure at some point by the agent to properly cover that off at some stage in that sort of relationship. And in the best scenario, it shouldn't even appear, or even if it does appear, it won't be relevant because the recruiter's done his job right. He's sourced the right candidate and he's had the right conversations.
I've absolutely got that belief. We've got to make sure that the process is correct at the very beginning. Is it a flawed process? It's not a flawed process because so many people, as Stephen mentioned, 20 years ago, were quoting about documents that, as Stephen says, is a lot of rubbish. It's not, because these same things are still happening, and it's 20 years of evidence that people will. The markets might change, people might move jobs much more often, but ultimately, if we stick to a process that's tried and trusted, I think Gareth's going to actually talk about some statistics that might back that up, hopefully. But I would absolutely believe that the process that we are following is one that we can believe in at the beginning, repeat it with the candidate on that candidate journey throughout, and make sure ultimately at the end that there's no surprises.
Yep. Okay. Great. Good point, Michael. Thank you very much. Gareth, I want to switch over to you. Okay. To deal with the second issue that Stephen mentioned, which was actually everyone needs to get used to this because counteroffers are getting less and less a bigger deal because of the frequency in which people are moving jobs now. It's actually becoming a very normal part of negotiating with your employer. So it's perfectly possible for that reason to accept a counteroffer because that's just a potential and viable choice that a person might make.
Well, I think you're right. I think that the frequency of the counter offer is growing just because of the increase in level of movement that we have within our markets. But that's not to say, Stephen's point earlier with regard to the fact that it is the propaganda from recruiters. I don't believe it to be the case at all. I think that as the market is moving on and we've got this greater frequency of change, it is inevitable that this statistic is going to grow. We track it within our business, within BIT. And in the first half of this year, we have had a 15% of all offers counter offered. Now that's down from what it was last year. It was at 22.5%, which we found to be an exceptional year for counter offers, and ultimately was a very, very competitive year within the tech sector specifically.
Can I say one thing, Gareth?
Yes.
Are those figures the frequency of counter offers or the frequency of counter offers accepted?
That is the frequency of counter offers, not necessarily accepted. We train our people in order to actually educate our candidates with regard to what is happening and how to ultimately test what is being put in front of them in order to actually prove the legitimacy of the fact that the reasons that have taken them out looking for the job in the first place are actually going to be the elements of the deals, or sorry, the things that we would say that were the deal breakers to that candidate prior. We want to make sure that all those things are refreshed in their mind and that they're aware of what brought them to the market in the first place. So we go through a process of trying to manage people through this in a very close way, but it's not in a heavy-handed way, like Stephen was implying with regard to the recruiter propaganda element. We are, I think, an evolving industry that is becoming ever more mindful of the candidate that we operate with. Some will view it as a commodity, but we have to remember that these are real people and ultimately they have decisions ahead of themselves. The frequency of the counter offer is something that is coming up just as part of our business, but I think that as a recruitment team, certainly within our business and across the market as a whole, I think we've got greater understanding of it. We've got a greater understanding of how to tackle the counter offer process and ultimately manage it to a successful conclusion, certainly for that candidate. But from my perspective, the frequency is something that is a concern to me, but something that we are very capable and able to deal with within our business and sector as a whole, I feel. I think it's just something that's going to happen.
Let me just kind of intercede at this point, because the recruiting animal, our good friend recruiting animal, has just said a very interesting point, which is why don't we believe Stephen's central point that recruitment counter offers is propaganda?
Well,
propaganda
would say that, wouldn't they?
Well, yeah, I mean, exactly. The accusation to you two gents would be, of course, you guys would.
I am a recruiter myself, but not.
Yeah, we've all been there, man. We're all agents in the past or currently, so we understand the game. But how would you sort of deal with the accusation that, of course, Michael and Gareth Udix, and this question is directed to Michael and Gareth. How would you deal with the accusation that some people in the crowd might say, well, of course you would say that, but isn't it true? The primary motivation, you can't trust the advice coming from an agent when he's persuading this candidate to refuse the counteroffer, because it is, he's vested in it. He's got a big stake.
That is quite fair, but it's quite sad to hear ultimately that people have a very strongly perceived view such as that. I think that as time is going on, recruiters are becoming more mindful of their own personal brand and their reputation. And to be shoehorning people into an offer where they are not comfortable, I think is a very reputationally damaging thing to do. And I think that as we grow as recruiters and as businesses, reputation is absolutely key. And I think that ever more so than before, this is right in the forefront of recruiters' minds. So you may not get them to take the offer at that particular time. And if you do lose that candidate, there's stats that go about in the market to suggest that 60% of all counter offers that are accepted, that employee will be looking 6 months from that date. I think that's a stat that I found earlier from Clear Sky Business. So, that's a very strong stat in order to reflect the fact that ultimately they will come back in the market again. And if you do look after them in a reputable and fair and human way, then you're going to find that candidate coming back to you as a recruiter of choice. And at that point, then you have the commitment for the future.
Can I ask a question, Gareth? If you have a client X, and they come to you, and recruiters aren't only recruiting these days, they're helping with all manner of hiring and recruitment and employment issues. If a client X comes to you and said, I've got someone who's a really important member of our team, has been offered a job elsewhere, and we would like you to help in retaining this candidate, how would you go about retaining that candidate, where on the flip side, in this instance, it would now be in your commercial interest to retain the candidate for the employer? and tell the candidate all the reasons why their career will be enhanced by not accepting an offer elsewhere?
Well, I think we have to support both candidates and clients. And if one of our clients was asking us to support them to evidence to one of their employees why they shouldn't leave, I think that we have to do a respectful, fair and honest job in supplying information that would be pertinent. But the thing that I would go back to first of all here would be the initial reasons as to why the candidate came to the employer to hand in the notice, because these are the deal breakers. And unless you can solve the issues that are creating the deal break situation here, you're never going to get an amendment to the problem that is ultimately going to be a long-term lasting solution. So the solution, I don't think, is what we will do is not provide the solution, but we could open up our clients' eyes in order to understand what that future solution may be. So that can be things that are, I think that a lot of these conversations get fixated on the value of money when it comes to the counteroffer. And I think that whilst the money is very important, the money nowadays is becoming lesser of importance to the candidates and to the employees. It's all about the progression. It's about the flexibility, about the modernization of that business and how they ultimately will, I suppose, help them to adapt into a working lifestyle that works for them and their family and for a business. And there are loads of different dimensions that you can take to this that I think has greater credence and meaning to the candidates. And ultimately, if a business is willing to sit and talk to me in order to understand what those softer issues are, then I think we could open up their eyes in order to look after the whole attritional aspect that they may have right across the whole of the workforce, and ultimately try and implement these things in order to reduce that.
Yeah. But Michael, how about you with the same scenario?
Well, I think, again, I'm always puzzled by how a counteroffer it takes for somebody to look to leave a business before the counteroffer is actually presented. I strike it as odd that, again, I go back to the point about the start of a journey with a candidate. I would always encourage a candidate to actually go, if they were really concerned about whether the right environment they were in, if it's about needing more money or if it's needing better conditions or whatever, the merit is for them looking to be in the market in the first place. I don't understand why they can't just go and have a conversation with the client there and then. It would be very practical to do so. With their own employer, absolutely. Yeah. If it means that they need to come to us and ask for some advice, maybe on the market, I also invest in that whole factor that I will get repeat candidates down the line in 6 months' time. If they accept a counteroffer, they're going to come back to me anyway. If it's the one, statistics prove that. And equally,
I think you're spot on, and you're really hitting on something really important, which is that certainly in the UK and maybe in other places as well, but in the UK, people are very averse to confrontation, and they're scared to have that discussion with their employer, often to the point where they'll go and find and accept a job elsewhere rather than have the difficult conversation with their boss in saying, well, look, my career's not going the way that I wanted it to. I wanted more responsibility. I wanted to train in these areas. I don't feel as appreciated as I did do. So people often go and accept a job elsewhere rather than having that difficult conversation. So I think you really hit on something vital there, that people need to be more adult, not only employees but employers, and having that conversation where they might find that, frankly, a candidate or an individual thinks that the employer's been negligent, they've not been looked after in the way that they think they could or should have been.
I think what most candidates Sorry, I was going to say there, I think what most candidates forget is that, they have to have that conversation at some point, regardless of whether it's the addressing of the problem at the beginning with their manager or it's at the point of exit where they're handing in their resignation. So you can't avoid it. So you have to face it up. And if you can amend and fix the issues that are creating a deal break situation, then ultimately the problem is solved. So, I think candidates need to be more brave with regard to how they tackle these issues.
Isn't it also this actually leads to Stephen's last point, which I'll throw to both of you guys in turn, which was culturally, maybe this is a cultural thing in the UK. We have a communication crisis between employer and employee, let's say. The communication isn't complete to the point where the candidate, the employee does decide to leave, but it might just give the setting for a reset of that relationship. So maybe in a weird way, it's our way of solving this communication crisis. And isn't that therefore a good reason why a counteroffer should be duly considered. You know.
But if you're going to reset this, I think that the counter offer is an awful long way down the line to actually wait to get it reset. You know, it should be, as we're indicating there, it should be done at the beginning of the unhappiness, let's just say, in around the beginning of before any process of recruitment kicks in. So it comes back to more bravery from candidates, from my perspective, in order to ensure that they've closed off all of the options and they are certain that this is the time to go to market because those options are absolutely closed off.
Gareth, you're very clear that the candidate owns the responsibility for this, and personally, I've got some sympathy with that view. But what would you say to the argument to say, look, you know, maybe the employer has not created the environment where this dialogue can occur, and recruitment agencies actually themselves might be a good example for this, because it is can potentially be a very aggressive. Get on the phone, you know, we've been there. So that doesn't necessarily, is not conducive to the sort of environment where a guy might say, hey, listen, guys, I think I'm looking for other opportunities. How would that be met by a recruitment agent? It's like,
look, I think that the days of not being able to relate to your manager and to have open discussions are at an end. You know, this is not the Are You Being Served days of the 1980s, ultimately, with such a hierarchical type of structures within business. You know, more modern businesses that I interact with and ultimately promote within our organization here are pretty employee-centric. They have got a good openness, a good style of management. There is a relationship there that is positive and progressive. And ultimately, that should be fostering this type of communication before it becomes a problem. And you have that clarity with the employee before it does. Within recruitment specifically, you know, you're absolutely right. You know, we are masters of our trade with regard to the management of these processes, but ultimately are a massive failure sometimes within our own businesses in order to actually see these things coming. It is something that I think will continue to be rife within recruitment just because of the nature of the business and the awareness that people have within it. But the only way that we can circumnavigate this is, as I say, that you have that openness and that transparency and that style of management that really comes through in order to promote that open communication, so you've got clarity of what's going on within your employees' heads.
Michael, going to you, the counter offer as an opportunity to reset, given the fact we were terrible communicators internally, given the fact that the managers haven't created the environment for this dialogue to take place, given the fact that the employee hasn't had the courage to have an early conversation, you know, isn't this our solution? You know.
Well, communication is the solution. It's nice and simple. Recruitment or staffing or moving people internally or out in the external market, it's very, very straightforward. It's all, to me, it's all about the person's attitude, their commitment to wanting to move, and nice open dialogue. Whether someone is looking to move for money or whatever their reasons might be, if that person is not in an environment where they can actually go and speak to a manager, or they're in the wrong job ultimately. That's my view. Things have moved on so considerably from when, I better not go and speak to the boss. He doesn't talk to people till 10 o'clock in the morning. That environment is hopefully very much gone. Anybody that is looking and career minded and got motivations, they've got to see beyond money. They've got to see beyond a fear of having that conversation. They're going to have it at some point. They might as well have it early. It's even easier for the person to have it if it's in an everyday conversation with, you know, over a coffee or at the water cooler.
I think you again, you're hitting on something really important there. Employers need to be conscious that they're as much as they hire new staff, they're going to be losing staff, and people will come to them with resignation, and they need to not only head these things off at the pass, but be prepared for surprises, which is odd, but be prepared for those surprise resignations of someone that you thought was absolutely in with the bricks suddenly comes and said, look, I've had an offer, I'm going to go elsewhere, and be able to respond to it in a really cool way, frankly, that doesn't close doors but opens doors, that maybe allows you to have the conversation then, look, what can we do about it? There are ways in which employers can work on their retention skills to make sure that, yes, they head things off at the pass, but when a surprise resignation comes in, they're able to have the conversation and maybe address things, maybe do all the things that can save the candidate. But even if they can't save the candidate, they're in a position to then wish them well and say, look, for all the things that you're looking for, we can't give you that, but we wish you well. Shake your hands. We'll take you out for a beer, and maybe at some point you'll come back and work for us, because boomerang hires are much more common today than they ever have. People coming back to an employer having had time away elsewhere, not only have a huge amount of value to them, but if you can create the environment in which they can come back and everyone is cool with it, then you can get a far better, more three-dimensional workforce where people can come, can go, and no one is suppressing their feelings about this or that or the other in a workplace where they feel they can't have the conversation and the only out for them is to find a job elsewhere.
You're absolutely right. I think that the modern employment has got much more regular movement than ever before, and ultimately burning bridges is ultimately a big risk and a potentially massively detrimental risk to how you grow your business in the future, because you just don't know what will happen and who you will need. But you touched on a point there, Stephen, that I think is the key thing with regard to this. If you are an employer and you are suffering attrition of key people, you need to take a step back and look at the reasoning as to why this is. One person in isolation is not a problem. A series of people coming who are integral to your business is a massive issue, and it is one that is inherent within the business, and it's a problem that needs to be solved by the owner of that business to ensure that the right entities and ingredients are in place in order to actually make sure that you're attracting the staff to want to stay and work for you. And there could be lots of tools in order to do that, but that's what I would usher my clients to go back and look at, particularly if this is a manifestation of a much larger problem rather than just one isolated incident.
Yeah, absolutely. On the right, I can see Recruit Animal is mentioned that non-competes, contracts that prevent someone from going to work for a competitor, are becoming much more prevalent in the States, which again highlights the fact that employers are trying to somehow tie down employees by contract and discourage them from considering jobs elsewhere. And I can see why employers would be tempted to do that, but by doing it contractually, you're implicitly saying, well, we don't really trust you to stick to the relationship that we have that's not on paper. And I can see why employers do it, because as we've seen, people are moving around more frequently. They're circulating the job market more frequently. They're going away and they're coming back. But the cost of losing an individual is now, even if it's not more in cash terms, it's now much more apparent to employers how much they lose in cash terms, in the work that's not done, in the loss of opportunity when someone leaves them. So you'd have to side with employers who are thinking, well, what can we do about this? This is the problem for us. And if we can address this, then we don't have to recruit, we can retain a bit more. And perhaps recruitment agencies can also be in the business of retention and be involved with their employers on that side of things.
I think if touched on a good point there. I think that the candidates themselves, I think they need to be, as I say, braver in terms of addressing this with the employers, but the employers need to be thinking proactively and trying to preempt this at every opportunity, Stephen. I think that this is going to be the key difference, I think, in terms of the differentiator of one quality of client versus another moving forward. Sorry, I'll let you say. So what, you were about to say something, Stephen?
No, I was just clearing my throat, but I thought Hung was going to jump in there.
No.
I'll jump in if I can. One thing, just on that point about it being cheaper to retain than to replace, I think it's an interesting point when you think about the effort that people will go through to get to that counter-offer stage. If someone's been on the candidate journey, it's maybe taken 3 months to go from one interview through to two. I know it's a bane of your life in room 101 about the 3-stage interview. Sometimes that's what's happening out there. So for a process to have maybe taken 3 months for an external opportunity to come through, suddenly for somebody to be able to be in a counter-offer position purely from a client perspective, that this is a financial decision, my auto action here is to make sure I quickly counter-offer. I better keep the person. They're making a decision in the space of a resignation meeting, as opposed to a process that someone's really thought through and went down a journey on for a couple of months, maybe a couple of weeks, certainly. That to me is, and also just on the other point about how things are developing in the States with regards to contracts, I'm not actually averse to that. I think actually, if a client is so keen to protect their staff, it's going to be reflected on how contractors or perhaps the permanent resource are going to be rewarded. There'll actually be less reason for people to want to move. And if somebody's got such good working conditions, the actual reason for a counteroffer at that point, they're really going to be set and moving if they're going to do that, if their conditions are so good. So I don't actually have a problem with that. I think if that's going to start to creep in more and more, it just means we know exactly where we're dealing with, and people are in better working conditions. It might be more difficult to move people, but people will still ultimately have, and candidates still have their the real merits for why they want to move, and that should be flushed out very early.
Yeah. I think that the candidates also need to understand that the ambitions of their employer are primarily driven by the disruption of that person leaving and what that will mean to their business. I think that the recruitment fee, the cost of replacement is one thing, but it's that lost income from the actual output from the person is the key driver. And as you say, in a resignation meeting, Michael, you might be sitting in there for anything from 5 minutes to an hour and a half, whatever it may be, but you're making fundamental promises, ultimately driven by that order and workbook behind you as the employer, and therefore I think some of these decisions can become somewhat rash, ill thought through, and ultimately there can be very wide ramification on the back of you're making a commitment and a promise to one person. What does that mean to the rest of the employee base within the organisation? And it can be very rash decisions here. Employers need to take a step back and look at the fundamental problem, but the candidate also needs to have a wider addressing of their issues, but also understand the motivations of the employer as well.
And with the rashness comes the regret further down the line. Hence the 60% move on in 6 months. I mean, that's something that's borne out for a number of years, and I think the regret that's there it'll only be on the part of the client. It will eventually take its toll on the candidate, and that's why they'll be back in the market. The problems that they can cause in between through resentment from other people, that maybe unexpected flight. That can happen also. So, yeah, these are ramifications there that should never be underestimated in a preemptive measure.
It's a fair point that employers do often counteroffer in haste and regret at leisure. One key thing that I would, if I was advising candidates to do and always do, is if you're made a counteroffer and you're resetting your relationship with the employer and all of those things, then whatever the new terms are, get them in writing. Don't play games with the employer and try and do back and forth with the new job offer that you have. But get it in writing, and if need be, go through HR and make sure that everything's all down there. I had a candidate years ago who was he'd been offered a job with a client of mine, and his counteroffer from his current employer said, "Well, you're so important to me. What I'd like to do is give you 50% share in the company, 12.5% each year for the next 4 years." And when I heard this, I'm thinking, well, this is unbelievable. This is the most amazing counteroffer I've ever heard. Of course, he stayed where he was. It was all on a handshake. And 4 months later, the employer that he had sold the company to someone else, and they never got his shares. So always get whatever your counteroffer is, get it in writing, make sure that it's something that can be held to, and that it doesn't fade away over time just based on, oh yeah, we'll see you right in the future. A counteroffer, in the same way as a new job offer, has to be in writing and affirmed, and everyone agrees to the terms of it, and you know where you all stand. Don't simply go on that handshake and shaking a nod and a wink.
Absolutely agree.
For sure.
It's happened in many instances where verbal commitments have been given, but ultimately they've never materialised, and therefore the candidate has made rejected a good job offer and has stayed where they are, but they come back to market again. It happens. It's quite serial, that action, actually.
I think that is. I think the guys there have introduced probably the strongest rebuttal with that last point, in the sense that a counteroffer is ill-considered, often emotionally driven reaction. That leads to bad outcomes. So where are we, guys? I think ultimately, I think Stephen, I've got to be honest, I think Michael and Gareth have made a very strong argument that the advice on not taking a counter offer isn't just recruitment propaganda, even though I don't think they've eliminated that particular view, because I think the recruiters do have a problem in trying to play honest broker here. They are a vested interest. But having said that, it is also true that you can't cover up sort of these deeper problems that have generated the resignation in the first place, or generated the job search behavior in the first place, by this reactive, knee-jerk decision that the manager's made when he's been brought to crisis. So very good effort, guys. I think Stephen has been probably fundamentally refuted there. So well done, you two. We're gonna move on to the next stage. The next stage is just a very brief part of this show. It's the 101. The place. What is the thing that has been annoying you in recruitment that you want to throw into 101? So Stephen, I'm going to kick off with you. Tell me what's been upsetting you, sir.
It's not a physical thing. It's kind of an ephemeral thing. It's a notion, and I'd like to dispense with it. And it's the notion that when an employer interviews a candidate, there's the theatre of recruitment dictates that the candidate presents as they already want the job. When they don't, they're there to find out if they're going to want the job. It's a two-way street. But of course, the candidate goes into the room saying, "Oh, I'd love to get this job," when really that's a bit of folly. They need to go through the process. So I would like to throw into room 101 the notion that a candidate already wants the job simply because they've attended for an interview.
Yep, very good. I think that's true. Let's get away from this song and dance routine. It is a bit embarrassing these days, and not true to the candidates' true motivations often. Okay, Michael, over to you. What is the 101, the thing that you want to throw in there, man?
Well, I actually opened this up to the FPSG training session we were doing earlier, and we got a couple of things come back from some unrepeatable, but not for this forum. But the one that I decided to settle on was one that hopefully will help candidates, help recruitment consultants, ultimately help our clients, and that's the PDF CV. Very difficult to work with, can cause numerous delays with the way that formatting comes through, and if you want your CV to be presented in the best possible way, stick it in Word. Keep it nice and simple. 2 pages I would absolutely recommend and be an advocate for. Keep it simple. We'll do the rest from there with cover sheets and any of the nice comments that need to go with it. So that would be my room 101. Get rid of PDF CVs.
Sounds like you're tired of reading long CVs there, Michael, is it?
What's that, sorry, Gareth?
It sounds like Michael's tired of reading long CVs there. I can understand why.
These eyes are looking tired. Yeah, absolutely.
Chucking it over to you, Gareth. What's the 101 you want to throw in there, man?
Man, I tell you, I'm probably going to give my age away here by saying this. I'll sound like a boring, grumpy old man, but to me, I think that email is the key thing. I see value for it. I'm 50-50 if I be honest, but what I think it does do, it can create a breed of lazy recruiter in terms of diminishing the level of relationship, communication and understanding that you have both with your candidates and your clients. I think that people try and rush a few words into an email, but it doesn't necessarily give the right context or the right meaning with regard to the detail of that information. Whereas if you're sitting on the phone or face to face, you can pick up tone, you can question, and you can ultimately get a lot more information with regard to that person or that job, and it is a much more effective way of doing business. So email for me, guys.
Yep, very good. Thank you very much. I think there's a lot to be said. I read an article the other day where email is dominating communication in business, never mind recruiting. Yeah. And this guy basically did an experiment where his response to every email that he received was, "Hey, let's jump on a call." And he did it for a week. Just his email back was, "Hey, let's talk about it." And he said, look, it took actually a lot more time that he previously didn't schedule, but he said he got so much more richer information out of it because he's having dialogue, the little nuances, the stuff that cannot be captured so well when you're writing it down, and also a different part of your brain. Like a different part of your brain is being used when you're typing something compared to when you're saying something. So yeah, it's an experiment. I think I need to get. I'm kind of phone phobic, so I'm into that era where I thought, you know what, schedule a call, don't interrupt me, I'm not picking up the phone, that kind of thing. But I think I need to change that because I think there is some scope to have that little bit of human to human touch. We've got to bring that back in some way.
Worth an experiment, I think.
Yeah, we should switch. You get used to one way of working, don't you? Let's switch it and see what happens.
Absolutely.
Okay, guys, that's been a fantastic show. Thank you very much for your contributions. I'll leave Stephen with the final words, actually, because this is going to be our last show for a little while. So, Stephen, I'll throw it over to you to let the people know what the longer term plan is for Tell Me I'm Wrong.
Thank you very much. Yeah, that's been a great session. Fantastic. This has been the 6th of a block of 6 shows. As I'm sure most of the people watching will know, we run a variety of shows that get produced and put onto the recruiter.zone website. As of next week, we're going to have a much fuller schedule where I think there's pretty much a show every day from a variety of contributors, not only me and Hung, but a number of other fantastic show hosts who are all experienced and professional recruiters in their own right. So there's much more going to be coming up. I'm planning to have a new show. If you've ever heard the radio show called Chain Reaction, because we're all professional interviewers, we're very rarely interviewed. And the new show is going to be called Recruitment Relay. Recruitment Relay will run from a week next Thursday. I'll show you a wee bit of the here. This is going to be the show. So that's going to be coming from a week next Thursday. And essentially, the first interview, Louise Trines will be interviewing me. The second interview, I'll be interviewing someone else. And then the third interview, that someone else will be interviewing another person. So we'll basically be passing the baton each week, being interviewed and interviewing and getting into the backgrounds of people in recruitment, HR and in-house recruitment, and finding out how they got to where they are and what their career has consisted of. So as I say, that's going to be coming in 2 weeks' time. Tell Me I'm Wrong won't be here next week. 2 weeks from today is, and I hope these two guys with us are going to be here. 2 weeks from today is going to be True Scotland, or True Glasgow to be more exact. If you want to know more about that, go to trueglasgow.com. There are still, I believe, 12 tickets available. So it's already really well booked up. It's at the Hard Rock Cafe in Glasgow, and I do hope that everyone will join us for that.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Stephen, for taking part in it and to be the protagonist. Actually, it's not easy. Stephen's basically stepped up there and said outrageous things for the last 6 weeks. He doesn't believe half of that, but it's part of our experiment to try and get a debate going. And we need to take an opposite position sometimes to expose the argument and to see with a little bit more forensic details to what it's all about. Anyway, that's about it. So thank you for watching, everyone. Join us for the next time Tell Me I'm Wrong is back. Thank you to our guests, in particular Gareth Biggerstaff at BIT Resourcing, and thank you, Michael. I forget your name, Michael.
Taggart. Yeah.
Michael Taggart, of course. Michael Taggart from FPSG Recruiting in Edinburgh. So thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.